The following is a special presentation of Tony Curry Radio.
On a podcast we do here every single week called Bite by Bite. He's Michael Coleman. He's the CEO of the Heart of Alabama Food Bank. As you can see that over his left-hand shoulder. I'm Tony Curry. This week we're talking about the difference between generational and situational poverty. We got into this a little bit last week, and it was pretty fascinating. Michael, talk about what generational poverty is.
Yeah, and let me just say before we get started, one of the whole reasons we do this is because Food Bank is in a response to different types of poverty. And so to learn food banking is really to understand who our customers are, and does food banking actually help, and is there a difference in how we treat generational poverty versus situational poverty? And the answer to that question is yes, across the board. And so this really matters for us to help understand about how to move people forward in life. So generational poverty is defined as two or more generations who have lived in poverty. Now, there's very little what they call absolute poverty in America. Absolute poverty is a lot of things that we see in third world countries, where people literally do not have the resources to survive where they are. And, so they don't have the facilities, they don't have access to water, they don't have access to any food whatsoever. And so they're just literally getting up every day and surviving. That's really not where people in generational poverty are, because of things like our government provides assistance, the community provides, assistance. But generational poverty is nonetheless very different than situational poverty. So if you look back at really where you start to see some real generational poverty that we witness today, is you can go back to the time where our government, with the absolute best of intentions, started issuing out welfare. But what they did, they were targeting people in poverty where there were just women and children. And I'm a fan of that. And please, I don't want the audience to understand this is not color-based. This was for white, black, anybody who was suffering in our country. So this is not race-related. This is a poverty class issue. And so the idea was to give them a lift, to make sure they had enough food and could make it in life. But unfortunately, what it helped do is it helped the family structure, when the men realized that a woman, even though they were in complete poverty, that a woman couldn't get any support unless the man was outside of the household. And so lots of times they would break up a family because they needed the money. Now, that was not the intent, but that was the effect, oftentimes, not in all cases. And so you see the poverty class begin to become much more matriarchal than patriarchal. The middle class is much more patriarchal, but mothers tend to dominate in the poverty class. And this is just one of the factors. I don't want to oversimplify it. It's not the only factor, but just one of many factors. So imagine if you've had a young mother who now is dependent on government assistance to make it with her children, and then the child grows up there, and then the child turns into an adult, begins to have her own family, again, not connected to a man, or maybe could have multiple fathers. And then so now that original mother's a grandmother. And so you get two or more generations who have only known government assistance, or even if they're working, minimum wage type employment. And so they've only known the chaos of poverty. They've never realized anything other than just in this struggle to survive. Now, the reason that's so different is because in situational poverty, that can apply to anybody regardless of what their income is. So anybody could run into a catastrophe. You could have a tornado knock your home apart, flooding. You could go through a divorce, and if your spouse who leaves you is the primary breadwinner, you see that more so with women being now having to go into the workforce where they maybe were a stay-at-home mom, but just to have enough money. But all sorts of things, the death of the breadwinner, a catastrophic illness, all sorts of things. And all of a sudden, you're used to making plenty enough money to put food on the table. And now you find yourself, you're not even close to making ends meet. Now, some people have support structures and safety nets, like churches, family, that they can depend on. But with situational poverty, you're like, okay, look, I just got fired from this job. I have 3 months of savings. I've used my savings up. I've got a lead on a job that I think I'm going to have in 2 months. Can you give me enough? And that just gets them over the hump. And then when they get the job, they go back to where they are. So we tend to think, oh, let's help people in generational poverty out like the same way. Let's help them get over the hump.
Yeah.
But the problem is in generational poverty, there is no hump to get over. You can give somebody in generational poverty typically $400 to pay a light bill, or you could give them $4,000, and typically they're going to end right back up in the poverty because they simply do not have the skill sets to manage money and to navigate because they've never known anything but the chaos of poverty.
They've never known anything else but the poverty. And you just said it. I think that is really fascinating because I don't think as a person or a person who's known a lot of people that have never been through that type of poverty, whether it be generational or situational, understand that that is a social norm that they're just used to. If you've had generational poverty in your entire life, goes back 2, 3, 4 different generations, which is 17 to 20 years, by the way, each generation. And that's just the way it was. It's not this to say these people don't want to have a better life or they don't want to work as hard. It's just that's who they are.
They literally do not know. And think about it. If you've never had a man come home from work, it gets up, goes to work every day, comes home, typically as we do, we spend time with our families and we're helping with the children. We are, helping, plan for the future, and all those things are absent. And so the moms are having to just go through the chaos. And again, it's just surviving to the next day. So when food banking comes along, we're like, okay, we want to be there for both groups. Almost nobody has a problem with situational poverty. All of a sudden, they're in a food line. COVID did this to many people. All of a sudden, they're in a food line for the first time. They're typically embarrassed. They feel denigrated. They feel ashamed. They feel like they're a personal failure. And so we want the food banking experience to be good for them because we don't want there to be shame associated with this. So, but we know that we give them food for a month, 2 months, 3 months. At some point, they're going to come out. I mean, there's lots of people, we help somebody one time, and then they're back on their feet. But it's the generational problem that people seem to have the most issue with. And that's where they think we're creating dependence. But as you can see, it goes much deeper than that. So from a food banking perspective, I would take this generational poverty and kind of splice it up a little bit and understand it's just what you said. They will oftentimes say they want to go to work. And I believe they want to go to work, but they don't know how to manage time. Some of these very basic skills, they don't know how to manage their time. They don't know how to think ahead because none of that is valued in generational poverty. There are skill sets that aren't learned and that keep them from moving forward. So a lot of social networking, or a lot of social services, I should say, are designed to not just give them things, but to then help develop those skills that they're missing that aren't typical, that are needed in middle class workforce, but are not taught in poverty class. And so that's a real challenge. It's an ongoing challenge because we really have two sets of cultures working against each other. But when you look at forever dependence, so there's the people who their whole life they're just going to be dependent because they grew up in this. All right. And you could go back and say, well, who's to blame? Why do we keep perpetuating this? But the reality is these people would likely starve because they don't know any other way. I mean, they are literally just out there surviving. But there's also people, think about this. People say, well, don't feed those people, but they've got children.
Mm-hmm.
And the children are, and to punish them, which I think is misguided, because we have an expectation sometimes of people, but we've not equipped them to be able to be successful or helped equip them. But you also have those children who are growing up in an environment they did not ask to be born into. They are there and they're learning the skill sets. And so we want them to have a chance to come out of that. We want to give them an offering. But in the meantime, they've got to have the basic necessities to survive.
They're the same people that say they shouldn't have had as many kids. Like, you tell that family.
No,
yes.
you can, no, absolutely. Now, if people say, well, then why does this woman have 5 kids? I'm not saying that question shouldn't be asked, but it's a sociological question that's outside of food banking.
Sure.
Because whether that person's right or wrong, or whether somebody's living a life of dependence, what I'm saying is that person is not typically like me and you, in that they have been taught all these skills and they're just lazy and don't want to do anything. They literally don't know how to climb out because they've never seen anybody do it.
Yeah.
They don't know. And so they're stuck in this. And then the last little group in there is all the seniors. Now think about this. The seniors have worked their whole life, many of them, but no savings. They worked minimum wage jobs their whole life, no 401ks. And so now they're just surviving off Social Security. And lots of times in a poverty class, children are not there to lift up their seniors. Children are still there, and grandchildren are pulling Social Security money from them. In other words, they're still dependent somewhat on grandmother, and granddad to help them. And so, but they're never going to get any further. Yeah, they were working, but now they're to the age they either have illness or health issue, whatever it is. So they're going to need to be taken care of the rest of their life, or at least be given some subsidy there by the food bank. So do I think all of that's okay from a societal standpoint? No, we want everybody. I hate generational poverty because it hurts the person who's stuck in it. But then when I look at the children there, and I'm like, it's not the fault of those children. And then I look at the seniors, and I'm like, these are people who perhaps have worked their whole life and just don't have the ability to care for themselves in older age. And I think it's incumbent upon us to lead in those situations with compassion. And we won't get into it this episode, but one of the things I really enjoy working with is when you interact with people in generational poverty, you try to not only give them emergency need, which is the food, but we try to give them an off-ramp that they can come off and say, well, maybe I can get some skills to then move into the workforce. So that's economic mobility. And we've got some exciting initiatives to help some people with that. As we continue to build that, there'll be more about that to come in future episodes.
This is Bite by Bite.
This has been a special presentation of Tony Curry Radio.